Hello, my name is David Carr and today I'll be showing you how I made my electric violin. The first stage in the process was simply to sketch out and try and work out what I wanted the violin to end up like. Whilst this was quite a lengthy process, I ended up reverse engineering my acoustic violin. This would ensure that I got everything in the correct place and all of the proportions stayed true to each other. This was essential when creating an electric violin that would ultimately be comfortable to play and easy to swap between the acoustic and electric. To make the process slightly easier and more accurate, I purchased some of the parts online, such as the neck, fingerboard and electronics for the violin. After consideration, I settled for an electronic violin active control system. This was because it had an inbuilt amplifier as well as volume and tone controls on a back panel. This would allow me a bit more diversity since the violin was intended for silent practicing with headphones. I also purchased rosewood adornments for the violin, such as the pegs, chin rest and tailpiece here. After I'd bought all of these, I produced a simple prototype of what I intended the electric violin to become. This was particularly useful because it allowed me to map out exactly where all of the components and circuitry would sit within the body of the violin. It also led to certain elements being slightly scaled up and altered within the design to accommodate all of the parts. For the main body of the violin, while selecting materials, it took a while, but I decided upon a laminate of walnut, birch and cherry. I was able to strip these down and form a crosshair laminate that I could easily build up together. This would allow me to have the denser birch on top, which would be good at carrying the sound waves and also act as structural bracing. Because of the highly sculptural design of the main body, the different woods will be worn away to create sweeping curves within the laminate. With all of the decisions made, I then started to prepare the wood by sanding back and truing datum surfaces before they could be laminated together. To start with, I laminated each side, as this would be easiest to do, and then I worked on joining them together. Because I wanted the laminates to join properly at the crosshair, I drilled a series of centre holes through the centre walnut panel and corresponding ones to the centre sides of either blocks. These were positioned so that dowel pegs could be used to ensure proper alignment, and these would remain encased within the final body. Once this was done, the main block was then laminated together into the finalised block. Once this was done, I then started to square back all of the sides so that it could be post-processed on a bandsaw to cut out the basic shape of the violin. The rough top and side profiles of the violin body were cut out on a bandsaw. Because of the volume of material I needed to remove, I cut a lot of relief channels so to not stress the laminates. Once the basic profile had been cut out, I then worked with more traditional methods to get the profiles completely back to the line. Whilst the main body was still relatively square-edged, I started on the long process of recessing out for all of the circuitry and components. This took quite some time, but I was able to recess a large enough cavity to accommodate all of the circuitry. With this done, I then worked on creating a level and square recess for the crystal transducer pickup that would sit below the bridge. It was imperative that this recess be correct and square to the other components on the violin, otherwise the bridge may have been misaligned. Once these key points had been finished, I was then able to carry on with the shaping of the violin and sculpting it into a generally pleasing shape. After measuring, drilling and pegging the neck and body of the violin, I was then able to mate them both together. These were permanently glued in place whilst using spacers to ensure the correct alignment. With the neck and main body now unified, I was able to then complete the shaping and finish the body off to a higher level. At this stage I was also able to test fit and finish any final adjustments needed to the main body of the violin. With the main body more or less completed and ready for finishing, I now turn my attention to the sculptural framework that goes around the body. This was cut from 5mm plywood, hoping to give me the best strength to weight ratio that I could achieve with woods. Because of the foreshortening effect of going from a flat 2D drawing to 3D parts at angles, it took a while to get all of these correct. I was able to temporarily glue most of these parts into place so that I could check all of the alignment and measurements around the body. Because I didn't want any visible fixings through the outer sculptural framework, I created location marks where the feet would attach to the main body. This would be imperative for when it came to attaching the framework at a later stage, both by increasing the gluing surface area and acting as location across all of the elements attaching to the violin. After these features had been created, the main body in these areas was wrapped with sellotape. This will allow filler to be used to create the sculptural shape mimicking the bodywork, and will prevent the filler from sticking to the bodywork. For this I used a very fine Carr body filler for its strength and durability. I continued with this around all of the other joints and the framework until the main elements had been built up. Whilst this was curing, I decided to work on the pegs on the violin. Because I was going for a very streamlined effect, I used a peg reamer to set the pegs in quite close to the body and scroll. Once this was done evenly across all 4 pegs, I then proceeded to shorten the pegs and dome them over. The intention of this was, when the peg was placed back through the peg box, the protruding part would just appear as a simple dome on the surface. With the work on the outer frame now completed to a reasonable stage, I decided to fully complete the main body of the violin. This was to allow it good time to settle and adjust to the pressure of the strings before the outer framework was glued into place. The finish that I chose to apply to the main body was a cellulose-based sanding sealer. Once applied and set, this was then rubbed back with ultrafine wire wool to a good surface finish. The sealer would now act as a very hard-wear and durable finish for wax to then be applied and buffed up to a high sheen. After 2 coats of beeswax had been applied and then buffed up, I then proceeded to assemble the rest of the elements to the body. The end button could now be slid into the end of the main body, allowing the tailgut and tailpiece to be assembled into place. At this stage, the circuitry and components were finally assembled into permanent position. Once this was done, and the body of the violin had been left for a couple of days to settle, I decided to string up the violin. This was first done to a low tension, gradually increasing each day, and finally bringing it up to full tuning pitch. This now meant that the main body of the violin was now fully playable and completed, and just needed the framework to be bonded into place. Whilst the violin body was settling, I continued to work on the main framework. I continued to sculpt the elements, adding more filler where it was needed and removing in other places to try and create a very pleasing sculptural form. It took quite a while, but I tried to create visual interest in every joint and junction around the frame. At this stage, before proceeding any further with the framework, I temporarily attached it to the main body of the violin. This was to check that all of the fixing points were still in the correct place and nothing had moved or misaligned. This also gave me the first opportunity to play the electric violin and get a sense of what it would be like. Proceeding on to finish the main framework, I applied a very hard-wearing 2-pack automotive paint. The use of this particular type of paint was quite important, as it doesn't get affected by chemicals once it's cured, and it shouldn't shrink back with heat exposure. Once this had cured off, I could then sand it back and treat the surface as needed with filler and then sanding back to create a better form to the framework. After this was done, I sprayed on a black coat of hard-wearing 2K paint. This was to act as the last high-build coat and was then sanded back to the near-final form. At this stage I also cut out the Perspex bumper bar to add onto the framework. This was finished to a satin gloss level and then added onto the framework. This element is specifically here to prevent damage to either the framework or the bow of the violinist. If, for example, when playing on the E string the right hand should drop, the hair of the bow would collide with the framework. Once this was done, I did a final test fitting to the main body to ensure that everything was in its final place. The framework was now ready for its final coat to be applied, so this was the last chance to undertake any alterations. The final finish I decided upon for the framework for the violin was a medium to heavy spark texture using satin black paint. I decided upon this specific texture finish as it should give a very luxury high-end appeal to the violin. This specific texture should also act to hide any blemishes and marks which may occur during the many years of playing ahead. With both elements of the violin now completed, it was time to bond them together. I took particular care to remove any paint build-up on the mating surfaces of the frame. I also carefully keyed in the mating surfaces on the main body that I'd been careful not to apply wax to in the finishing. These elements were then bonded together carefully and precisely, thus completing the project build for the electric violin. Here you can see the finalised electric violin against the early prototype that I'd made. You can see that along the way there's been ever so slight variations, but it's remained quite true to its original concept. And again, the finalised electric violin against the acoustic violin that this all started from. Here you can clearly see how the design has been sympathetically taken from the acoustic and then blended into the electric violin. The design of the electric violin was heavily stylised and sculpted to give it a high-end luxury appeal to it. There were also a number of different elements sculpted into the form of the violin, particularly where the framework meets the body, to try and give a hint at things such as furled up wings and flight.